They didn't seal the door because of what they saw. They sealed it because of what they heard. In the summer of 1846, the Mississippi air hung thick and unmoving over the Carter estate, pressing down on the fields, the trees, the men and women who worked from sunrise until their shadows disappeared into the dusk. The house stood proud and white against the horizon, tall columns rising like silent sentinels, its wide porch wrapping around the front as if to embrace a world it quietly ruled. From a distance, it looked like peace. Up close, it felt like something else entirely. The estate had rules. Clear ones, spoken once, never repeated. Workers entered through the side entrance. They did not use the main staircase. They did not wander the upper halls. And they never, under any circumstances, walked to the far end of the east corridor. At the end of that corridor stood a door. It was not ornate, not painted in special color. No gold trimming. Just thick, dark wood, aged and heavy, with a brass handle that caught the light in a dull, tired gleam. It had no name carved into it, no label. No visible lock from the outside, though everyone knew it was secured, and no one was allowed to open it. No one ever explained why. The first time the sound came, Samuel thought it was a trick of the wind. He had stayed late that evening, stacking crates near the kitchen entrance, sweat clinging to his collar despite the fading sun. The house had gone quiet, too quiet. Even the usual shuffle of boots and murmured conversations had dissolved into stillness. That was when he heard it, low at first, almost beneath notice, a strained vibration. Like a chair scraping across wooden floors in a distant room, Samuel paused, listening. The sound stretched, grew thinner, higher, twisting into something that did not belong in a silent hallway. It was not furniture. It was not wind. It was a voice trying to push through wood. The scream did not burst. It dragged itself outward, long and breathless, as though whoever made it had no air left to spare. Samuel stood frozen. It came from the east corridor, from behind the locked door. He told himself it was imagination. The mind playing games in the dark. He finished his work and left without another glance down that hallway. But the next night, he heard it again. This time, he was not alone. Mary, who worked in the kitchen, dropped a stack of tin plates when the sound rose suddenly, sharper than before. The metal clattered against the floor as she covered her ears, eyes wide with confusion. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. No one answered her directly, because they all did. The scream began low, a tremor under the floorboards, then climbed into something thin and piercing. It wavered, cracked, then faded into a trembling whimper before vanishing completely. Silence followed, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. Eyes drifted toward the corridor, toward the unseen door at the end. No one moved. They knew the rule. The owner, Mr. Carter, had made it clear when the door was first installed years earlier. "That room is not for you," he had said, calmly, even politely. "It will remain closed." There had been no anger in his voice. That was what made it worse. The screaming continued the following night, and the one after that, always after dark, always from the same place. At first it came once, then twice. Then it lingered longer, scraping against nerves, burrowing into the minds of those who tried desperately to ignore it. Some said it sounded like a woman. Others swore it was deeper than that. Rougher, like something struggling against a gag. On the sixth night it changed. The scream did not rise gradually. It erupted, a sudden, violent burst of sound that echoed down the hallway and slammed into the kitchen walls like a thrown stone. Mary stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf. Samuel felt the vibration in his ribs. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. The following morning, Samuel found Mr. Carter on the porch, reading correspondence as if nothing unusual existed within his home. "Sir," Samuel began carefully, hat in hand, "there's something inside that room." Mr. Carter did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was calm. Too calm. "There is nothing you need concern yourself with." "Sir." The screaming. "You heard nothing," Mr. Carter interrupted, folding the letter precisely. "And you will not speak of it again." Samuel felt the weight of that sentence settle on his chest. That night, the screaming grew worse. It no longer sounded distant. It sounded close, as if the source had moved nearer to the door. 3 workers gathered near the hallway entrance just before midnight. No one suggested it aloud, but the thought passed silently between them. If someone was trapped inside, if someone was suffering, they could not ignore it forever. The scream began again. Long, ragged, wet, it scraped down the corridor and curled around their ankles like smoke. Samuel swallowed hard and stepped forward. Each footstep toward the door felt heavier than the last. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. The air grew colder, despite the summer heat outside. He reached the door. Up close, it looked thicker than he remembered. The grain of the wood twisted unnaturally in the dim light, shadows pooling along its edges. The scream cut off mid-breath. Silence. Samuel hesitated, then placed his hand on the brass handle. It was freezing, not cool. Freezing. A chill shot through his palm and up his arm. Before he could turn it, something shifted on the other side. Slowly, a dragging sound, like fabric pulled across wood. Then 3 distinct knocks echoed from within, sharp, deliberate, measured. Knock, knock, knock. Mary gasped. Samuel jerked his hand away. They did not run at first. They backed away slowly, eyes fixed on the unmoving door. Waiting for another sound. None came. They ran only when the hallway light flickered. The next morning, 2 carpenters arrived from town. No explanation was offered to the workers. Mr. Carter supervised personally. Thick planks were carried inside. The door was not opened. It was sealed. Boards nailed across its surface, horizontally and vertically. The hammer strikes echoed through the corridor like distant gunshots. With each nail driven in, Samuel felt something settle. Not relief. Something else. As the final plank was secured, a faint sound rose from behind the wood. Not a scream, not a knock. Breathing. Slow, controlled, aware. Mr. Carter paused briefly, eyes narrowing at the sealed entrance. Then he turned and walked away. The workers were instructed never to approach the corridor again. Within days, several left the estate. Those who remained spoke less, laughed less. They avoided being indoors after sunset whenever possible. But sometimes, when the night grew deep and the crickets outside fell silent, the sound returned. Not screaming, just movement, a soft dragging across the floor, a faint exhale pressed against wood. And once, very late, Samuel swore he heard something whisper through the cracks between the planks. Not words, just breath shaping itself into almost language. Years passed. The east corridor gathered dust. The planks darkened with age. No one removed them. Mr. Carter never mentioned the room again. When he died, the estate changed hands. Renovations were recorded. Rooms repainted. Windows replaced, but the sealed door remained untouched. In the official ledger from 1846, a single line appeared under property expenses. Structural reinforcement. East wing. Permanent. No further detail. No explanation. Visitors who toured the estate decades later noticed the corridor felt colder than the rest of the house. Some claimed it was poor insulation. Others refused to walk its length at all. One historian years afterward asked about the boards. The caretaker simply said, "That room was sealed for a reason." When pressed, he added quietly, "They say the screams stopped after it was closed." A pause, mostly. Because sometimes, on heavy summer nights when the air refuses to move and the house settles into itself, a faint sound slips through the silence. Not loud enough to prove, not clear enough to understand, just enough to make you stop, just enough to make you wonder what was sealed behind that door in 1846, and whether it ever truly stopped trying to get out. 170 years later, the door was still there. Dust had settled into its cracks. The wood had darkened, aged, tightened against the frame as if it had been holding its breath for over a century. The east corridor of the Carter estate no longer smelled of oil lamps and sweat. Now it carried the faint scent of polish and old paper, the kind of sterile preservation that comes with turning a private home into a historical landmark. Tour guides avoided that hallway. Not officially. They simply walked a little faster when they reached it. In 2019, a graduate researcher named Daniel Harper stepped into the estate with a recorder in one hand and a leather-bound notebook tucked beneath his arm. He wasn't interested in ghost stories. He didn't believe in them. He was studying undocumented plantation architecture and structural modifications in pre-Civil War Mississippi. His goal was simple: verify rumors that the East Wing had been renovated in 1846 under unusual circumstances. Rumors didn't impress him. Records did, and the records were strange. The estate ledger from August of 1846 showed a sudden expense marked as reinforcement permanent. No explanation, no room name, no materials listed beyond timber and iron. More unsettling was the journal entry Daniel found in a county archive, written by a traveling carpenter named Elias Boone, called to Carter Estate for urgent work. The entry read, "Door to be sealed. No inquiry permitted. Payment generous." That was it. No detail about why. No note about what was inside. Just that it had to be sealed. Permanently. Daniel stood at the mouth of the east corridor, staring at the door. The planks nailed across it were original, old-growth wood, hand-cut, reinforced by iron brackets that had long since rusted into dark stains along the grain. He reached out and touched one of the boards. Cold. The caretaker cleared his throat behind him. "We don't recommend disturbing that section." "I'm not disturbing it," Daniel replied calmly. "I'm documenting it." The caretaker hesitated. "Some parts of history aren't meant to be reopened." Daniel almost smiled. That kind of sentence only strengthened his resolve. He spent the next 2 weeks combing through archives, newspaper clippings, census records, personal letters, and what he found was inconsistent. In September of 1846, 3 workers abruptly disappeared from employment records at the Carter estate. No departure notes, no relocation, just names that stopped appearing. Samuel Reed, Mary Calloway, Thomas Griggs. Daniel traced Samuel's name to a brief mention in a church ledger. Requested prayer for disturbance of spirit. No further attendance. Mary's name surfaced only once more, in a handwritten letter to a cousin in Jackson. "The nights here are not right," she wrote. "There is a sound that comes from the far end of the house. They tell us not to listen." Daniel read that line 3 times. They tell us not to listen. He returned to the estate after hours, armed with a small thermal scanner and an audio recorder. Not because he believed in anything supernatural, because sealed spaces sometimes hold structural anomalies, air pockets, temperature differences, hidden chambers. He stood before the door again, alone this time. The hallway lights were dimmed for the evening. The house creaked softly as old houses do, settling into the cool of night. He pressed the thermal scanner against the wood. At first, the reading was consistent with the rest of the hallway. Then it dipped, 3 degrees colder along the center plank. Daniel frowned and adjusted the angle. 5 degrees colder now. Not dramatic, but noticeable. He knelt and ran the scanner along the lower edge of the door. The temperature dropped again. He straightened slowly. Airflow. He murmured to himself. There must be a gap behind the reinforcement. He placed the recorder on the floor and stepped back. Silence filled the corridor, deep, thick silence. Then, faintly, something shifted. Daniel's head snapped up. The sound was subtle. Not a scream, not even a clear movement. More like a drawn-out exhale pressed against wood. He waited. Nothing. He almost convinced himself it was the building settling. Until it came again. Longer this time. A strained vibration, as if air were being forced through something narrow. Daniel swallowed, forcing logic to stay in control. "Mwah! Wind," he whispered. There were no open windows in the east wing. The sound stopped abruptly. He approached the door and placed his palm flat against one of the boards. The cold seeped through instantly. He withdrew his hand, flexing his fingers. The temperature in the hallway hadn't changed. Only the door felt that way. The next morning, Daniel requested permission to inspect the interior of the sealed room for structural research. The estate board hesitated, citing historical sensitivity. But after weeks of persuasion and the promise of non-invasive procedures, they agreed to remove only the outer planks for examination. On the day the work began, 3 board members stood at the end of the corridor watching. The first nail resisted the pry bar. It groaned as it loosened, wood fibers stretching and snapping in protest. The sound echoed unnaturally down the hall. Daniel felt an odd tightening in his chest. The second plank came away easier. As more boards were removed, the original door beneath came into view. It was thicker than expected, and scratched. Not decorative scratches. Deep, uneven gouges near the center, as if something had dragged against it from the inside. One of the board members stepped closer. Those weren't there in the restoration photos. Daniel leaned in. The marks were old. The wood darkened along their edges, worn smooth by time. That he reached for the brass handle. It looked unchanged from archival photographs. Untouched. He hesitated only briefly before turning it. It did not move. Locked from within, a chill ran through him. "Is there another key?" someone asked. The caretaker shook his head slowly. "If there was, it hasn't existed in my lifetime." Daniel studied the hinges. Old iron. Rusted but intact. "If it's locked from the inside," he said quietly. "Then it was sealed without opening it first." No one responded. He stepped back as tools were brought in. The hinges would have to be removed. The first bolt snapped under pressure. A loud crack filled the corridor. And then, from the other side of the door, a sound. Clear this time. Not imagination. Not settling wood. A single knock, sharp, measured. 3 times. The men froze. Knock, knock, not knock. The caretaker's face drained of color. "That's not possible," one board member whispered. Daniel felt every rational explanation slipping through his fingers. He pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. Then, faintly, a dragging movement, slow, deliberate, right up to the door. His breath caught. The final hinge bolt gave way with a metallic snap. The door sagged slightly in its frame. For a moment, no one moved. Then Daniel grasped the handle again. This time, it turned. The door creaked inward. The air that spilled out was colder than the hallway, dense and stale, carrying a scent not of decay, but of something long confined. The room beyond was smaller than expected, empty. No furniture, no chains, no visible explanation. Just bare wooden floors and a single narrow window, boarded from the inside. Daniel stepped across the threshold. The temperature dropped instantly. His breath fogged faintly in front of him. "That's impossible," someone murmured behind him. "It's summer." The walls bore faint vertical marks, as though something had repeatedly brushed against them. Near the center of the floor were scuffs, circular. Daniel crouched to examine them. They formed a rough pattern, almost like pacing. Back and forth. Back and forth. For years. He stood slowly. The air felt heavier now, oppressive. He turned toward the doorway. The men standing there looked uneasy. Then the sound came again. Not from the hallway. From inside the room, behind him, a low, strained exhale. Daniel spun around. Nothing visible. Just empty space, but the temperature dipped further. And in the silence that followed, something brushed against the inside of the closed window boards. 3 soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. One of the board members stumbled backward into the corridor. "One need to close it?" he said quickly. "This isn't right." Daniel forced himself to breathe steadily. He did not believe in hauntings. He believed in evidence. But the evidence here defied explanation. The pacing marks, the scratches on the door, the cold, and the knocking. He stepped backward out of the room. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted slightly. The air felt normal again. The caretaker's voice shook. "Seal it." Daniel looked back at the empty space. Logic screamed at him to stay, to investigate further. But instinct whispered something else. The door swung inward slightly on its loosened hinges. And from the darkness within, barely audible, a whisper. Not words, just breath shaping itself into sound. Waiting, Daniel stepped fully into the corridor. The door creaked shut on its own. No wind, no touch. Just a slow, deliberate closing. The men stood in silence for several long seconds. Then the caretaker picked up the fallen plank. "We seal it," he repeated. And this time, no one argued. As the first nail was driven back into place, the sound echoed once more from inside. Not a scream, not a knock, just breathing, slow, patient, unchanged by time. By the time the final board was secured, the hallway felt still again. But Daniel knew one thing with unsettling certainty. Whatever had been behind that door in 1846 had never left. It had simply been waiting. And when the corridor emptied that evening, when the estate lights dimmed and silence returned to the east wing, a faint vibration pressed once more against the wood, low, strained, almost hopeful, as if it knew someone had listened, and might again. The first time the sound came from beneath the floorboards, no one believed it. In 1846, the Carter estate in Mississippi was a place built on routine. The sun rose, the fields filled, boots pressed into dirt, and the big white house stood at the center of it all like something permanent and untouchable. Inside, the air smelled of starch and oil lamps. The hallways stretched long and narrow, lit by flickering flame that cast shadows which never seemed to sit still. The east corridor was the quietest part of the house. It ended in a heavy wooden door. Everyone knew it. No one approached it. The rule had existed longer than most of the workers. Don't go down that hall. Don't touch the door. Don't ask questions. At first, the screams were thought to be coming from outside. Samuel Reed heard it while hauling water buckets past the rear entrance. A low vibration rolled under his boots. He paused, listening. It sounded like an animal caught in brush somewhere beyond the tree line. But the fields were empty. The woods were still. And the sound did not echo from a distance. It came from below. He felt it through the soles of his shoes. A strained, muffled cry rising through the earth. He shook his head and kept walking. By nightfall, 3 others had heard it. Mary Calloway stood in the kitchen when the vibration hummed up through the floorboards beneath her feet. The plates on the shelf rattled softly. She froze, hands hovering over the basin. The sound rose higher, not wind, not thunder, a scream, not loud enough to shake the house, just strong enough to make her stomach tighten. It felt wrong, like a voice buried too deep. When it stopped, the silence pressed down hard. That night, Samuel lay awake in his small quarters behind the house. He told himself it was nothing. Wood expands, shift. Old houses breathe, but around midnight, it came again, this time clearer, a dragging sound beneath the floor, then a breathy, desperate exhale that trembled up through the boards. He sat up slowly. The scream followed, long, strained, as if someone were shouting through dirt. The next morning, workers whispered about it in low voices. No one spoke openly. You didn't complain about sounds in Mr. Carter's house. But fear doesn't stay quiet for long. By the 4th night, the sound had changed. It no longer seemed buried deep underground. It felt closer, not beneath the yard, not beneath the trees, beneath the house itself, directly under the east corridor. Samuel walked the length of it the following evening, lantern in hand. The door at the end stood still, unchanged, its brass handle dull in the low light. He crouched halfway down the hall and pressed his palm flat against the floor. Cold, unnaturally cold. The rest of the house held the day's heat, but here the boards felt as though winter lived beneath them. Then it came, right under his hand, a tremor, followed by a low, rising scream that vibrated straight through bone. He jerked back, heart pounding. The sound scraped upward, not through the walls, not through the air, through the floor. Mary heard it too. So did Thomas Griggs, who dropped a lantern when the scream rose sharply beneath his boots. It was not imagination anymore. It was coming from beneath the house. Someone finally approached Mr. Carter. He listened without expression. "You're hearing settling timber," he said calmly. "Nothing more." "Sear." Samuel pressed carefully. "Timber doesn't scream." Mr. Carter's gaze hardened. "There is nothing beneath this house but soil and foundation. You will return to your duties." The conversation ended there. But that night the sound grew violent. It began with scraping, long, uneven drags beneath the corridor. Then pounding. 3 heavy thuds that rattled the floorboards. Mary stumbled back from the kitchen doorway, eyes wide. "It's trying to get out?" she whispered. Samuel didn't answer. He was staring at the east corridor. The door at the end seemed closer somehow. The shadows around it darker, pooling at its base like ink. The scream followed, not buried this time, not distant, right beneath the hallway, high and raw and furious. And then silence, a deep, suffocating silence that lasted nearly a minute. Samuel took a step toward the corridor. Another. The floor felt hollow beneath his weight. Halfway down the hall, he heard something shift below him. A slow, deliberate movement. As if something were crawling in the dirt into the foundation. He stopped. The movement stopped. He stepped again. It followed, matching his pace, beneath him. Mary called his name from behind, voice trembling. Don't. He ignored her and moved closer to the door. The temperature dropped sharply. He could see his breath faintly in the lamplight. Then, directly under the thrill of the sealed door, the sound erupted. A scream so loud it rattled the lantern glass. It did not echo outward. It forced itself upward. The floorboards beneath the door trembled. And then, a crack. A thin line split across one plank. Dust rose from the fracture. Samuel staggered back. The crack widened slightly, revealing darkness beneath. Not soil, not rock, just blackness. And from that blackness, a single breath escaped, slow, controlled, aware. Mary grabbed Samuel's arm and pulled him backward. It's under us, she whispered. Whatever it is, it's under us. The next morning, Mr. Carter ordered workers to reinforce the east corridor flooring. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Carpenters arrived quietly. Boards were lifted. Samuel watched from a distance as the first section of floor was removed. There was no cellar beneath the house, no crawl space large enough for a man, just a shallow foundation trench. Empty, the carpenter frowned. Nothing here but earth. They replaced the boards, nailed them down tighter than before. By nightfall, the screams returned. Stronger, closer. Not just beneath the corridor now. Beneath the entire house, the walls seemed to hum faintly. The windows rattled. Thomas gripped a table edge as the vibration passed through the dining room. It's moving, he muttered. Samuel felt it too. A slow shift beneath the foundation, like something circling, waiting. Then the screaming stopped entirely. For 2 full nights, silence. Workers dared to hope it had ended. On the third night, it came back from inside the east corridor walls. Not below. Inside, a low scrape traveled upward through the wooden beams. Then a thud against the sealed door. From within the wall, Mary covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. It climbed, she whispered. Samuel stood frozen. The thud came again. 3 times. From behind the door, knock, knock, knock. The brass handle rattled violently. Not turning, just shaking. Mr. Carter appeared at the hallway entrance, face pale but composed. It will be sealed, he said quietly. The next morning, carpenters returned once more. This time, not just to reinforce the floor. They sealed the door itself. Thick planks nailed across it horizontally and vertically. Iron brackets bolted into the frame, no gaps left visible. As the final nail was driven in, a sound rose from inside the wall. Not a scream, a growl, low and steady, vibrating through wood. Mr. Carter stood watching, jaw tight. When it was done, he turned to the workers. You will not approach this corridor again. And for a while, they obeyed. The screams faded to faint vibrations, then to nothing. Months passed. The house felt normal again, until one humid night in late September. Samuel woke to the sensation of movement beneath his bed. A subtle shift, then a breath rising through the floorboards. Right beneath him. He sat up slowly. The breath continued, slow, measured, waiting. Across the estate, others woke to the same sound, not screaming anymore, just breathing. Under every room, under every wall. As if whatever had been beneath the corridor had spread. Mary fled the estate 2 days later. Thomas left without collecting wages. Samuel remained only long enough to witness one final thing. Late one night, he stood at the edge of the property, looking back at the house. The east corridor window faced him. It had always been dark, always boarded from within. But that night, faint light flickered behind it, soft, unsteady, and in the silence between crickets he heard it once more, not beneath the ground, not inside the walls, but from behind the sealed door. A whisper of breath, close to the wood, as if whatever had climbed from the earth had finally found its way into the room meant to contain it. The following year, records show 3 workers vanish from documentation. No departure notes, no burial records, just absence. The ledger contains one line added in careful handwriting: East Wing secured. Permanently. The house still stands today. The corridor still exists. Visitors say the floor feels colder there. That sometimes, if you stand still long enough, you can feel a faint vibration beneath your feet. Not enough to prove anything, just enough to make you shift your weight uneasily. And if you press your ear to the sealed door, some claim you can hear it, not screaming anymore, not pounding, just breathing. Slow, patient, as if it learned, over time, that it no longer needed to force its way up from beneath. Because eventually, everything built on a foundation begins to crack. He had never wanted to be there in the first place. Jonathan Hayes had come to the Carter estate because he needed the money. The summer of 1846 had been cruel to his family. The Mississippi sun relentless, the crops failing, and every coin he could earn mattered more than comfort, more than curiosity, more than fear. He was 17 and new to this world of endless labor, and he thought he understood what fear was until the first night in the East Corridor of the Carter estate. He had heard the stories on the way to the estate, whispered among other workers as they hauled buckets of water, stacked crates, and scrubbed floors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Some said the east wing of the house was cursed. Some said the workers who went too far never returned. Jonathan had laughed it off. Fear was for the weak. Misfortune was something you survived, not something that haunted you in whispers. But the house had its own rules. He quickly learned the strict path he was meant to follow: the side entrance, the long corridors, the kitchen, and the storage room. Anything beyond that, and the brass-bound wooden door at the end of the East Corridor, was forbidden. No one explained why. No one needed to. That door was the boundary between safety and the unknown. The first night he was alone, scrubbing the floors of the main hall late after the others had retired to their quarters. The lanterns flickered, casting uncertain shadows across the walls. He stopped suddenly when he heard it, a low, strangled sound, almost like a cry muffled by cloth. His heart jumped into his throat, and his hands shook. He glanced toward the end of the corridor. The door was still there. Plain adorned, ominous, locked. Forbidden, he told himself it was nothing. Just the wind, settling boards, his imagination. But the sound returned, longer this time. A whimper, then a soft scraping that seemed to crawl across the floor beneath him. He froze. Something was in that room, and it wanted out. He ran to his quarters the next day and shared nothing, pretending the experience was trivial. But every evening, as he returned to clean or carry supplies, the sound was there again. Not the same, never exactly the same, but always demanding attention, always suffocating in its intensity. Soon, he could feel the vibration of it beneath his feet. He had begun to associate the corridor, the air, the smell of the house itself with dread. One night, Jonathan was not alone. Mary Calloway, a kitchen worker, stayed late, scrubbing dishes when the sound returned. She froze as the cry rose through the boards. Her knuckles whitened around the basin. She glanced at Jonathan with eyes that begged for understanding, but all he could do was nod slightly. They had heard it together. That was worse than hearing it alone. Confirmation of its reality made it tangible, impossible to ignore. The sound changed over the next few nights. It was no longer distant, almost imperceptible. It was closer, more deliberate, more intelligent. He began to notice a rhythm. The dragging, the exhale, the scratches. Someone or something was pacing within that room, its movements slow, deliberate. Every time he stepped into the hallway, he felt it follow him, felt its gaze from behind the wood. The fear escalated into obsession. Jonathan could think of little else. He measured the door with his eyes, noting every scratch, every discoloration, every imperfection. He imagined the room behind it, small, bare, maybe dark, maybe occupied by someone in pain, or something in pain, something trapped. He began sneaking moments when no one watched to study the door more closely, pressing his ear to the planks, listening. Every breath became amplified, every footstep thunderous. He was afraid, yes, but afraid had become curiosity, and curiosity became necessity. He needed to know what was inside. The caretaker had warned him. "Some things are not yours to see," he had said quietly, eyes avoiding Jonathan's gaze. "The door is sealed for a reason. Forget it." Jonathan had nodded, but he could not. How could he forget the sound of someone or something crying? It clung to him even in the sunlight, even among the other workers. He dreamed of it at night. The door was a shadow in his mind, a living presence, and every sound he heard beyond the walls of the estate seemed to echo it. One evening, he approached Samuel Reed, a veteran worker who had been there for years. "Do you hear it too?" Jonathan asked. Samuel's face paled. He nodded once, tightly, unwilling to speak further. Fear was contagious, yes, but silence was safer. They did not speak again about it. But Jonathan could feel Samuel's acknowledgement like a shared secret. It was on the seventh night that he decided he would confront it. Alone. He waited until the other workers had retired. The moonlight spilled weakly through a narrow window, barely illuminating the corridor. Jonathan gripped the lantern and walked slowly down the hall. Each step was calculated, careful. The boards beneath him trembled slightly, as though recognizing him. He stopped just short of the door. The lantern flickered. The air grew cold. Not a chill from the evening, not from the earth, but something deeper, unnatural, pressing against his lungs. He leaned closer, pressing an ear to the planks. The sound met him immediately, not muffled this time. Clear, deliberate. Breathing, dragging, a soft whisper that curled into the wood like smoke. His stomach tightened. His pulse roared, yet he could not step back. Some force, curiosity or something darker, compelled him forward. Jonathan's hand hovered over the brass handle. Ice ran through his veins. He could see scratches around the edge of the wood, deep, worn from time. They told a story. He imagined desperate fingers trying to claw through, trying to escape, trying to reach out. He swallowed, trembling. The sound rose again, not a cry, not a scream, but a whisper, low and almost human. "Police." It seemed to say, or maybe it was only his mind, fear makes voices from silence. Yet something inside him accepted it as truth. He took a breath and touched the handle. The cold ran through his hand, numbingly so. The wood vibrated faintly beneath his fingers. The whispering escalated into a sharp, deliberate tapping. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. As though the entity inside was counting, measuring, waiting. He pulled his hand back, heart hammering. The corridor felt smaller, oppressive. His lantern trembled slightly in his grip. He knew instinctively he should step back. But leaving without knowledge was impossible. He had to see. The next day, he approached the estate owner, Mr. Carter, cautiously. "Sir, the door, there is something inside, we hear it." Mr. Carter's expression was unreadable. "The door is sealed. For a reason. You will not speak of it again." Jonathan's stomach nodded, but he knew arguments would not help. He had heard the voice. He had felt it. It existed. That night, Jonathan resolved he would witness what lay behind the door. Alone. The others had either fled or gone silent, too frightened to act. He gathered courage and waited until the estate was still. He entered the corridor, lantern in hand. Each step magnified the sound beneath him, the air charged with tension. He reached the door. The whispering, tapping, and dragging escalated. Cold pressed against his chest, fingers numb, breath caught in his throat. He pressed an ear against the wood. It drew a sharp intake, almost mimicking his own breath. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into eternity. He imagined the walls closing in. The scratches seemed alive. They twitched in shadow. And then a sound unlike any before, a low, rumbling moan, resonant, vibrating through the floor and the walls, through the very air around him. Jonathan staggered backward, lantern swinging wildly. The light danced across the door, highlighting deep gouges in the wood, edges darkened with age, etched with stories of the past. He realized then that the door was not just a barrier. It was a prison, not necessarily for a human, but for something that had intelligence, patience, and awareness. It had been waiting bound, perhaps even trapped, for decades. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the air. Jonathan returned the following morning, compelled by a force he did not understand. He brought Samuel and Mary. Together they inspected the corridor. The whispering had ceased, but the marks, the scratches, the cold, all persisted. They could feel its presence in the silence. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The knowledge alone weighed on them. Weeks passed. Jonathan became obsessed, studying the door, the corridor, the patterns of the sounds, attempting to record, to understand, to make sense. The other workers left or avoided him. Only Mary remained, quietly, sharing the burden of fear and curiosity. Together they attempted simple tests, tapping on the boards, listening, noting temperature changes. The wood radiated cold in unusual patterns. Movement beneath, sometimes a shifting vibration, sometimes a faint exhale. The final act occurred one humid August night. Jonathan, lantern in hand, pressed his palm against the door. The cold bit through his skin, numb, unrelenting. He heard dragging, counting, the whispering, rising into a crescendo of almost intelligible sound. He stepped forward, lantern shaking, and felt a motion within the door, as if whatever was imprisoned inside were reaching, stretching, yearning. He stepped back, heart hammering, lantern light dancing across planks, scarred by desperate claws, and realized with dread that the entity had agency, awareness. It knew they were there. It had been waiting for attention. The three stood in silence, the weight of history pressing down. Jonathan understood then that some mysteries, some doors, exist beyond human understanding. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation. A breath pressed through the corridor, slow, deliberate, and chillingly aware. They dared not approach further. The door remained. The building quiet. The cold lingering, subtle but insistent. The whispers and taps ceased for the night, but Jonathan and Mary knew the door was alive in some way, and they had merely brushed against its patience. When the sun rose, they left the corridor. The estate resumed its mundane rhythm. But for Jonathan, the fear, curiosity, and awe remained. He carried it for years, long after leaving the estate. He spoke to no one of the specific sounds, the whispers, the taps, the temperature changes. Only hints, vague warnings to those who asked. Some dismissed it, some believed it. But all who had stepped near the east corridor understood. Some doors are sealed for reasons that defy understanding, and curiosity can be both a gift and a curse. The Carter estate stands today. The east corridor remains. Visitors speak of chills, strange drafts, faint sounds. Only Jonathan can describe what he truly experienced, the cold, the whispers, the deliberate awareness of a presence confined for decades, patient, intelligent, and waiting. And as the corridor grows silent, it is only a matter of time before someone steps too close again and awakens what has been biding its time, behind the planks, behind the brass, behind the door. The Carter estate had stood for over a century when internet researchers first stumbled upon its legend. What began as a curiosity thread on a historical forum evolved into a full-blown investigation. Photographs of the long east corridor circulated, the brass-bound wooden door sealed behind planks, scratches visible in high-resolution images, shadows stretching across the grain in the fading light of archived photographs. Social media users debated. Amateur historians speculated. Paranormal enthusiasts whispered. The story was compelling because it had everything: a real location, documented absences of workers, archival letters, and the inexplicable mystery of a sealed door. Daniel Harper, a young historian specializing in antebellum architecture, discovered a ledger entry in the county archives that changed everything. The line was simple: East Wing reinforcement, permanent. No further explanation. At first glance, nothing unusual. But Daniel's instincts told him there was more. Every other ledger entry listed labor, materials, or minor renovations. This entry listed nothing but permanence. He cross-referenced the dates with census records and worker documentation. 3 names disappeared without trace around that same time: Samuel Reed, Mary Calloway, and Thomas Griggs. No death records. No relocation. Nothing. Curious, he dug deeper. Letters, journals, personal correspondence all pointed to the same anomaly. Workers had heard something, sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day, when shadows fell across the east corridor. The descriptions varied but shared a chilling consistency: scraping, dragging, breathing, soft knocks, whispers, and a cold presence felt beneath their feet or along the corridor walls. Daniel compiled hundreds of notes, transcribed audio from his own preliminary investigations, and compared them with secondary sources from the 19th century. The story was consistent. Something inside the door had been alive, aware, and persistent. He visited the estate with a small team, carefully documenting every detail. Modern equipment provided a new dimension. Thermal cameras detected odd cold spots near the door. Airflow measurements suggested the presence of a hollow chamber beneath the floorboards, though structural blueprints indicated nothing of the sort. Audio recorders captured low-frequency vibrations, barely perceptible, often dismissed as buildings settling. But when Daniel analyzed the data, a pattern emerged. The vibrations corresponded with times when workers reported hearing the whispers, the taps, the dragging. It was deliberate. It had rhythm, like a heartbeat beneath the wood. The team set up overnight observations, motion detectors, multiple audio channels, thermal scans. They even placed a small camera at the edge of the door, hoping to capture a visual of what had eluded human eyes for centuries. The first night yielded nothing conclusive. Shadows danced, wind stirred papers, nothing solid. The second night, the recorder picked up faint exhalations. Low, deliberate, rhythmic. Almost human but not fully intelligible. The temperature readings plummeted near the door, several degrees colder than the ambient hallway. The cold extended outward like an invisible field. Daniel and his team debated. Could it be trapped wildlife, rodents, insects? The pattern was wrong. Rodents do not pace in calculated intervals. Insects do not produce low-frequency exhalations or rhythmic knocks with an intelligence detectable across time. They consulted structural engineers. No crawlspace existed that could house even a medium-sized animal. The foundation was solid. The floorboards beneath the east corridor were intact, unbroken for decades. Then came the night that changed everything. Daniel positioned himself near the door with a handheld recorder. The team remained a few feet back, hesitant. Around midnight, the air shifted. The subtle exhalations grew into soft, drawn-out breaths. Something moved within. Not fast, not chaotic, but deliberate. The scratches along the planks seemed to stretch, as if the wood itself were reacting to a force behind it. A sequence of 3 knocks echoed from within: tap, tap, then a pause, then 3 again. The pattern continued. The team's cameras recorded faint vibrations along the wall adjacent to the door. The phenomenon was active, aware, and possibly anticipating observation. Daniel touched the brass handle. The cold was immediate. The temperature difference pressed into his palm, through his bones. He felt it. The presence on the other side was not a passive haunting. It was intelligent. It responded to proximity, to attention, to touch. A subtle vibration ran up his arm, then the air around the doorway shifted. Then came a low, guttural whisper, almost human, almost not, curling through the planks. It did not speak words, only breaths that mimicked pattern and rhythm. The team retreated temporarily, but Daniel could not let go. Days later, he coordinated a more extensive examination. A small section of the planks was carefully removed. Beneath, the original door was intact, thick, carved from centuries-old timber. Deep gouges scarred the surface, worn smooth by repeated contact over decades. Behind it, nothing could be discerned visually, but the vibrations persisted, the cold emanated, and the exhalations continued. Each scrape, each knock, each exhale was deliberate, forming patterns that Daniel compared to Morse code, to the pacing of human steps, to rhythm in nature. But none matched any known source. Daniel's notes became increasingly obsessive. He mapped the floorboards, the walls, every anomaly in the corridor. He analyzed the temperature data alongside the vibrations. The patterns suggested an intelligence operating behind the door, perhaps trapped for decades. It responded to presence, to sound, to attention. And it had memory. The sequences repeated over time with variation, suggesting awareness and adaptation. The team experimented cautiously. They tapped on the door, waited, and recorded the responses. The entity mirrored their rhythms, then altered them. It was not chaotic. It was strategic, intelligent, patient. The sense of presence was palpable, pressing against the corridor walls. Even without direct observation, the cold, the vibrations, and the rhythmic taps conveyed the awareness of a confined being capable of deliberate action. In interviews with locals, Daniel discovered oral traditions. Families who had lived in the area for generations spoke in hushed tones of the sealed door. Accounts varied, but all spoke of sounds, vanishings, and a palpable sense of dread emanating from the east corridor. Some claimed they could feel eyes watching through the walls. Others reported similar rhythmic sounds at night, even decades later. The legend, verified with historical documents now, had both empirical data and witness testimony. Social media attention exploded. Videos, photographs, and sound clips circulated online. Thousands debated whether the phenomena were hoaxes, supernatural, or something else entirely. But the deeper investigations revealed consistency. Temperature anomalies, vibrations, rhythmically timed exhalations, all measurable, reproducible, and persistent across observation. The door, planks, and original structure remained intact, effectively containing whatever lay within. The estate board eventually restricted access entirely. Daniel published detailed findings, cautious in his language, avoiding speculation beyond the recorded phenomena. Yet the recordings, charts, and analysis conveyed what words alone could not: a centuries-old presence, aware and active, behind a sealed door. The corridor itself had become a point of tension in historical preservation circles. Visitors reported cold drafts, subtle vibrations, and whispers near the planks. Some claimed to have seen shadows shift independently of lighting, hints of movement where none should exist. Even today, researchers agree on the basic facts. The Carter East Corridor houses an anomaly. Evidence points to something confined, intelligent, responsive, and aware of observers. Historical documentation confirms disappearances, alterations to the ledger, and sudden renovations. Oral histories corroborate the sensory experiences. Modern scientific measurement validates temperature anomalies, vibrations, and audible exhalations. Together, these elements construct a compelling narrative of confinement, awareness, and endurance across centuries. The door remains sealed. Planks reinforced. Hinges intact. The entity, if it can be called that, continues to respond to presence, silently through vibrations, cold, and breath. Each experiment, each observation confirms the pattern: deliberate, intelligent, patient. It waits. It learns. It endures. Daniel's publications encourage future research while cautioning against overconfidence. The phenomenon defies explanation, straddling boundaries of history, architecture, and the unexplainable. Any attempt to open the door risks triggering a reaction that cannot be predicted. Researchers continue to study remotely, documenting, analyzing, and hypothesizing. The East Corridor of the Carter Estate has become an internet legend, a historical mystery, a phenomenon verified by scientific measurement, yet remaining fundamentally unexplained. Visitors continue to report sensations, chills, and whispers. Researchers continue to measure vibrations and temperature anomalies. Social media continues to share images and sound files. The door, planks, and corridor persist. And beyond them, something waits, aware, counting, listening, patient beyond comprehension. It has endured centuries of isolation, yet remains engaged with the world just enough to remind all who approach that some doors are sealed not by chance, but by design, and some presences cannot be ignored.